No, Dan, I think you're absolutely right. It's really quite striking. Suddenly, the whole nuclear business has taken a back seat. I don't think we should be surprised by it. I think we have to go back to the beginning. Remember the Israeli intelligence projection that after 3 or 4 or 5 days, the Iranian government would probably collapse under the weight of U.S. and Israeli bombing and missiles, right? That didn't turn out to be the case. And then you have to listen to subsequent arguments made by President Trump over and over and over again that this country that was supposed to fall apart in 3 or 4 days, in fact, represented an existential threat, not just to Israel, but to the United States. Nobody seemed to bother to ask the critical question. If you think this state will only last a few days or maybe a week or two, then how could it possibly present an existential threat to the United States? Well, he never answered that question. And he had no strategy because the expectation was we bomb, they fold. Now, why would he have ever signed on for that? Well, I think we have to understand that President Trump only knows what he knows. This is not a highly educated man. I don't care how many good schools he supposedly attended. He's no different from many of the people running around in uniform with 4 stars that have never really studied or understood anything about the wars they were fighting. And when that expectation wasn't met, well, we then backed away from one set of goals to new sets of goals. And at this point, we've essentially thrown away everything else and said what we desperately really want is some way to open the strait. Now, of course, you and I know the straits were open before we bombed, but that's not the point. This has to open as a result of something that Trump does. In other words, it has to open on his terms, which explains why he submitted new terms.
And let's look at this. If this is a battle for the Strait of Hormuz, let's check out the scoreboard here and kind of see where we are. We obviously had this 40 days and 40 nights of bombing to try and force it open. That didn't work. Then we had a couple of months of this blockade. That didn't work. Then we tried the MOU. That started to work, got us up to about a third. And then Trump got impatient and tried to open a new corridor in the south. It was not part of the MOU. And now it's closed down. Now we've had, as of this morning, a 5th round of recent since the 7th of February. July. We've had 5 more rounds. But what has that accomplished? Let's check the scoreboard out. Oops, according to the Hormuz report, which actually tracks the ships, despite 2 U.S. aircraft carriers with heavy air cover, the United States could not keep the Gulf's biggest oil bypass open. Now, Fujairah port has effectively ceased operations, removing potentially up to 6 million barrels per day. And then, according to marine traffic data, shows fewer than a dozen vessels visibly crossed the Hormuz in the past 24 hours. And again, this is as of this morning. None used the U.S.-backed southern route through muddy waters. President Trump, on the other hand, said, oh, yeah, it's definitely open, but it's not. So what do you make of that? That's what's physically happening.
When all else fails and you can't make a case, you lie. That's where we are. What else is he going to do? He's going to lie and say, no, we've been successful. How many times does he have to say that? I remember Senator Kerry, not one of my favorite people, but nevertheless, on this occasion, he was honest. He was asked, well, what is General Petraeus going to do when he comes back to report to Congress? And he says, well, that's easy. He's going to report that he's been enormously successful. In other words, the truth is irrelevant. It's getting people back here in the United States, in Washington, and most important on Wall Street, to believe what he wants. Because if he can't do that, he can't manipulate the markets. If he can't manipulate the markets, that means we're in a lot of trouble, because when the truth comes out, the markets are going to crash. That's something we've lost complete sight of. We're up to 4.5% in the 10-year Treasury bond. Everybody, whether it's Goodluck or Luke Groman or any of the others that have looked at the bond market for years, or said, once we hit 5%, which is very, very close, we've had it. We can't service the debt. We default. So I think President Trump has got that in the back of his mind, whatever else he's doing right now.
Well, one wonders if he can pull it to the front of his mind, because that's the scoreboard that really matters. You talked about the issue with Kerry, with the lies that were told by David Petraeus during the Afghanistan war. You could literally say anything you wanted to there. And because the Taliban were never going to mass on Jalalabad and defeat the United States Army, the fiction would work, and it didn't have anything to do with markets. There was no oil involved, et cetera. This is a radically different situation here, because now then we're talking about the lifeblood of our economy in the Strait of Hormuz, with the flow of oil, gas, derivatives, and other kinds of fertilizers, et cetera. Now, that's why this is such a problem. So yesterday, there was an interview on Fox News with Trey Yingst and President Trump. And to his credit, Trey Yingst did ask a couple of really important questions that we would like answers to. Didn't really like the answers we got, but it's illuminating to see how President Trump answered them. Let's start, first of all, with has the war officially restarted?
Has the war resumed?
Well, I guess you could define it any way you want, but certainly we're beating them up really badly. They have to be beat up. We're hitting them very, very hard. We're hitting every single thing that they have along the shore, along the waterfront. You know, if you look at the Strait of Hormuz, it's now, we're finding it hard to find where they have anything. We have to stop it. We have to keep it open. I was going to charge a fee, but instead they'd rather spend a lot of money in the United States, which frankly is better because I don't like the idea of a fee. It's got to remain free because otherwise others will do the same thing. But I think we've made tremendous progress.
Yeah, we've made tremendous progress. And let's take a look at a few things he said in there. Number one, he said, we're hitting everything along the shore. Well, that shore is about 800 miles long. And as you've talked about several times, a lot of it is rocky, mountainous kind of cliffs, et cetera, not easy targets to hit. Then he also said, though, that we're having a hard time finding targets to hit. What, as a military man, does that tell you?
Well, it's something that we've experienced before with any of these air and missile campaigns, that eventually you run out of legitimate military targets. You hit everything, and you discover it hasn't made any difference whatsoever. That's when you begin looking for other things. You heard him talk about transportation infrastructure, roads and bridges. He's talked about desalination plants. He's talked about petroleum infrastructure. Why do you do that? You do it because you've run out of other legitimate targets. So that's simply a clear and unambiguous demonstration that the air and missile campaign has failed to deliver. Remember, everything was always predicated on the notion that if you hit enough targets and you hit them long enough, eventually everybody would walk out, cry uncle, and say, please, please stop. Put in front of me whatever you want me to sign, I'll sign it. Well, that's not going to happen. Because right now, this is analogous to taking a sledgehammer to the Rock of Gibraltar. If you think you're going to knock the Rock of Gibraltar down with a sledgehammer, you're going to be there for quite a while.
And, there's interesting also on this point of the air campaign. Trey Yingst did try to ask Trump, can you win this on just air? Gary, if you could play the one with Trump air campaign.
We're going to hit them very hard tonight. We're going to hit them very hard tomorrow night. We're going to hit them very hard the night after. And then next week it gets really bad for them because next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the bridges. We're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate.
Sorry, that's actually not the one I was thinking of here. I'm going to get to those bridges and the other things in just a second. But one thing Yingst asked him, can you win this only with air power, or will you need a ground power? And he, of course, didn't want to answer the question here. But that is the operative question. I mean, we can go back to the start of this in February 28th. But now that we have 40 days of experience, plus what happened in 2025, is there any capacity, Doug? I mean, anyway, even if they change tactics, that the air power can deliver what President Trump needs by opening the Strait of Hormuz?
The short answer is no, of course not. But there are a couple of other things to keep in mind. First, a friend of yours and mine, somebody we both know, Harry Kazianis, wrote a great article, I think it was in 1945, and it's all about the Navy and the fact that the Navy now has more missile launchers and tubes than it has missiles. In other words, our industrial base cannot keep up. It cannot provide enough missiles, enough munitions in a short span of time that would allow us to sustain the war against Iran. And we didn't say win it, but just sustain it. So I don't know how much longer we can continue to hurl munitions and explosives at Iran before we get to the bottom of the barrel. I mean, it's sort of like the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Eventually, you reach the point where you can't pull any more out. I think we're going to hit that point somewhere along the line in the industrial base with the missile production line. That's the first thing. Now, as far as what else can be done, ground troops, It is interesting that he didn't address it because in recent days, you and I know that he has. He brought up that he was considering seizing Clark Island. Of course, his great friend and supporter, Lindsey Graham, chimed in immediately and said, oh, yes, we've got to do that. That's the key. We've listened to General Wes Clark, whom I normally regard as highly intelligent and thoughtful, come on board and say, yeah, we're going to hit Clark Island. That's the key to success. I haven't seen any evidence that it will make any difference at all, but that's what he's done. And then finally, that great man, General McKenzie, the architect of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, has come on board and said, yes, we should seize Clark Island. We need to stand on Ukrainian soil, or excuse me, Iranian soil, and hold it as a bargaining chip. You know, Dan, this sort of stuff is just incredible. First of all, what does anybody think is going to happen if we try to move into southern Iran or in the Persian Gulf? They're going to be hit with everything you can imagine from every angle. You've got a country the size of Western Europe, 93 million people, and hundreds of places from which they can launch unmanned things like the Shahad missile, the Shahad drones, or various kinds of theater ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Those are going to take a terrible toll. If we have people sitting on this real estate, they're sitting ducks. What are they going to do? Are they going to use the island as a lily pad? You know, this is a sort of marine idea for the Pacific. Well, the problem is it doesn't work because a lily pad can be annihilated. But then you go down to Chabahar. That's come up for discussion too. Oh, let's take Chabahar. That's a city. Well, I think the Iranians are a lot like the Russians were when they retreated in front of Napoleon Bonaparte. They destroyed everything. They destroyed everything, leaving nothing for the French. They tried to do the same thing in World War II as the Germans advanced into the Soviet Union. The Soviets did not quite as successful as the Tsar was. But my point is, why would the Iranians sit there and say, okay, fine, let's bargain now. You're sitting on top of Chabahar. And then finally, once you've gotten somebody there, assuming they survive, what are they going to do? You know, where's this great ground force? How do you get somewhere? Oh, we're going to climb into V-22s and helicopters. Well, I'm sure that'll work very well. What did we see in Isfahan? We saw a very vulnerable special aircraft shot to pieces. Come on, this is different. This is a real war. Either fish or cut bait. And he doesn't want to cut bait. He keeps hooking up new worms to the hook and throwing them overboard, thinking that eventually the fish is going to give up. It's not going to happen.
It's not, and so if he's not going to do that, if he's not going to do the ground stuff, because from all accounts from some folks that we've talked to in the administration, that issue at Isfahan just spooked Trump and confirmed to him that it's a bad idea to do anything on the ground. So probably even Clark Island is not going to happen. However, he is thinking maybe I can try something different. It's okay if it didn't work to try to bomb all those granite mountains and trying to get these missile cities. That didn't work. How's about we instead shift over and have a new target set and really hurt Iran, and that'll make them come to the table by taking out their energy infrastructure.
Are you considering hitting energy targets or other locations inside of Iran?
I'll save the energy targets for last. But ultimately, we'll hit energy targets, yeah. But we're going to hit them very hard tonight. We're going to hit them very hard tomorrow night. We're going to hit them very hard the night after. And then next week, it gets really bad for them because next week comes the power plants. Next week comes the bridges. We're going to knock out all their power plants. We're going to knock out all their bridges unless they get to the table and negotiate.
So that last part there, unless they come to the table and negotiate, that's not what he means. He doesn't want to negotiate. He wants to surrender. So we'll set that aside for the minute. So he thinks this can accomplish it. But what, from a military perspective, Doug, first of all, what would happen in Iran if he hits those targets? But then much more importantly, what will Iran do in retaliation?
Well, Dan, we need to face the reality that this is effectively what General Keane and others like him have argued for. That is, finish the job. Finish the job amounts ultimately into a relapse into barbarism, descent into the Middle Ages. It means bringing your enemy to his or her knees. That's really what they're saying. In order to do that, in their minds, you're going to have to destroy everything. most important, not just the petroleum infrastructure, industry, and so forth, you're going to have to destroy the desalination plants. That's how you bring the country, in their minds, to its knees. Now, why is this not likely to work? Well, first of all, I think the Iranians are quite prepared to sustain the damage that he's threatening. They have found ways around it in the past. There are other ways to export petroleum, and they'll do it, and those products. Secondly, while this goes on and President Trump is sort of soothing his ego and postponing the inevitable admission of defeat, which has to happen for this to end, frankly, he's got to say, look, this hasn't worked. We've got to disengage. He doesn't want to do that. His ego won't permit him to do such a thing. That means the rest of the world looks at this and says, we're screwed. We're headed into a global depression, and that's where we're going. When you look at fertilizer and the 40-50% increase in the cost of it, it's not just the cost, it's the availability, the nitrogen that is vital and essential, the helium that you absolutely need for the production of microcircuitry. All of these things fall into the same categories. This is a catastrophe, and it's being brought on not by Iran, contrary to what we think. It's being brought on by us in our unconditional allegiance to Israel, because it is ultimately Israel that demands the destruction of Iran. We have no particular reason why we should destroy the Iranian state or murder most of its population. That's not what we're about, but that's what it's become. That's what you're describing. And that's why it's a relapse into barbarism. Now, what will the Iranians do? Well, what would you do? I would fight back with everything at my disposal. And I would punish, absolutely annihilate everything and anyone who stands with us. So if you're living in Kuwait or Bahrain or Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, or for that matter, even Saudi Arabia, I would get ready. Because if you think you're going to escape the consequences of Trump's war and Israel's demand for Iran's destruction, you will not. And the elites that are ruling in those countries will be swept out of power. They've already reached out to Jordan, and I am sure that they have thousands of weapons and missiles remaining that they will ultimately use against Israel. And there's not a great deal we can do. We cannot shut that down. And we've talked about this before. Our technology, as Ted Postal and others have pointed out, has not reached the point where we can reliably protect any of these places. The smart move, the intelligent move, is to recognize the limits of our power, to recognize the futility and say, that's enough, no more. We wish you well, Israel, but we cannot go on with this campaign. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. Do you?
I don't. But what I do see coming is, and Iran has been signaling some of the things they're going to do, in addition to the things you just mentioned about hitting those kinds of targets, same kind of targets that Trump said he would hit on Iran, they would impose upon our allies. Pardon me, but there's some additional stuff here. This so-called triangle of economic death here, that if Iran does more than just shut down the Strait of Hormuz, because now then they've also shut down Fajr, so that's actually added additional strain onto the oil supply right now. But they also said, along with Ansar al-Islam, the Houthis, that they could shut down the Bab el-Mandab at the southern end of the Red Sea and could potentially gum up the works even in the Suez Canal with some of the Houthi missiles. You shut down those three things right there as a result, as a response to what President Trump was doing there. And I mean, how could anything except for, I mean, a near-term recession start and possibly even a depression in the not too distant future? I mean, those things, that's got to get the attention of other people around the world that don't want anything to do with this war, doesn't it?
Well, there isn't anybody else out there that wants anything to do with this war. That's what we need to understand. The Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, all of these people are disinterested in this war. They want it to end. We're the only ones that are talking about war. When you go to Asia, we go to these conferences. Hegseth was just over there and talked about China. Everybody in the audience is looking at him like this man's lost his mind. They're not interested in going to war with China. Neither are the Koreans or the Japanese or anybody else. And now that we've demonstrated that we can't protect anybody because we just don't have the technology to do it, the question is going to be, why are we still in Korea? Why are we still in Japan? We can't protect anybody. If we can't protect somebody, then we're a magnet for trouble. We're a catalyst for conflict. And the sad part is that President Trump instinctively understood this during his first term, and he was thinking in the right terms. But, if you don't have a foundation of knowledge and understanding, you can be talked out of things that make sense in favor of things that don't. There's nothing firm that you can base your decision making on. And I think that's his biggest problem. So right now, he is bullying his way forward, hoping that something will happen, something will break. The idea that Suez could be shut down is not a new one. And frankly speaking, even though it's still useful to the states that, like Saudi Arabia and others, it's not what it was because of the Houthi operation. I was reading the other day, because I've had to understand the oil industry, and people that have looked at this industry since these things began have said the same thing. None of it has ever recovered. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz. It's access to the Red Sea. It's access and movement through the Suez. All of these places are suffering. What you're doing is you're taking a patient that's already on life support, frankly, in a purely fiscal, economic sense, and you're killing them. You're disconnecting them, and you're putting at least 1 billion people or more on this planet at great risk. You're making famine inevitable. You're stopping the delivery of food. Everything that you can think of that is bad is inevitably coming about because of this stupidity of making war against Iran on behalf of Israel. That's it. And it needs to stop. The sooner it stops, the better off we will all be. Our world is not going to end, and armies of Islamist radicals are not going to march into the United States. Well, so we've got some already that are here. They didn't have to invade. We let them in. But the point is that this sort of ridiculous notion that the world will end if we stop this is wrong.
It's more than that even. What you said was the moral issue that should greatly animate us, that if we continue on with the path that President Trump just laid out there, which especially what he said, and it sounded kind of like he has a plan for this to escalate next week into the kinds of targets that will spawn those kind of retaliatory attacks. If you only cared about humanity and just as a normal person, you'd like, all right, well, that's stupid. Let's don't do that because people could die. So President Trump doesn't seem to really be animated or motivated by what may happen to anyone else, but he does animate himself by what happens here because of the political consequences. Let's take a look at something else that does matter. You mentioned this a minute ago with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This is as of, I think, the 3rd of July. So this is almost 2 weeks old. But you see that even now that it's been completely closed, so it's worse than this now. This is the worst, the lowest our stocks of the SPR has been since 1983. May 20th to be specific. It is now at this, as of the 3rd, it was 319,000 barrels, and the lowest it had ever been was from its almost in its inception, was back in 1983, and now then we're almost certainly even further below that. And with the strait now cut off, and if you add anything else, that those numbers are only going to go up higher. What are the ramifications domestically for this?
Well, short term, they're catastrophic. People are not going to simply see prices rise at the gas tank. Everything is going to be more expensive because we understand that petroleum figures prominently in everything that we live on in the modern civilization. It fuels your trucks. It enables packaging, plastics. I mean, we could go on and on, Dan. So we know that's catastrophic. I think the question is, have we stopped exporting all crude? Have we stopped exporting any refined products like gasoline or diesel? I don't know. I need to check on that. We really need to know that. I think if we haven't, we will. And we have exported a great deal to Japan as well as to Great Britain. Great Britain is in terrible shape right now. And the fools in the British government have prohibited any more exploration and drilling in the North Sea, even though they know right off the coast of Scotland, they've got huge quantities of oil there. This should have been exploited a long time ago. They did not believe in building a cushion. There was no sense of the need to guard against insecurity that erupts in a way that's unanticipated. So it's not just us, it's also Europe and especially Great Britain. Germany is very close to the bottom. France is not far behind, except the French at least have had the good sense to maintain their nuclear capability, and that's helped a great deal. But I think we're going to see a lot of upheaval, particularly in Western Europe, as all of the things that you and I are describing begin to have an impact. And of course, there sit the Russians. They're happy to do business, but they sure as hell are not going to do business with people that continue to arm the Ukrainians. And essentially, when we say Ukrainians, that's a misnomer. How many troops do the Ukrainians really have in the field? You know, the latest casualty figures that I've seen are just disastrous. Every time they put something into the field, the Russians kill it. It's like a giant lawnmower that's sort of moving across. And every day it goes further and further and further and further. Pretty soon they're going to run out of gas, or rather grass to mow. And I think that's what's happening in Ukraine. Nobody seems to be concerned about that. That would help a lot if we ended that. But no one wants to do it.
No, that would there's a lot of implications for that. These two things definitely have a lot of continuity between the two of them, which all have negative pressure on our future economic aspects. I'm going to get to that Ukraine part in here in a second. But one last thing I want to look at that may also animate President Trump is the domestic situation because of his political outcome. There's one other part, and that's his physical life. He posted last week at Truth Social, said, I have given instructions that if I'm assassinated, 1,000 missiles will rain down on Iran and will destroy all this stuff. It will wipe out their nation and all this kind of thing. If anything happens to me, I've already left instructions. They're going to do that. And then today, this is just today now, some of his concerns, I'm sorry, that's the wrong one here. This one right here. Some of his concerns may be valid because there is a growing anger inside of Iran demanding retribution from their leaders. This one here, one of the Ayatollahs was quoted in the Fars news agency saying the killers of the martyred imam no longer should feel secure. Based on recent messaging of the supreme leader of the revolution, the demand for revenge and retribution for the blood of the martyred imam and other martyrs of the two recent is absolute. And then here on the Moshtaba Khamenei's social media account itself, he said the red flags of vengeance shall not be lowered. Moments from the people's attendance of the memorial ceremony for the martyr leader held on behalf of Sayyid Moshtaba Khamenei, the leader of the Republic Revolution. So now he's saying, yeah, the vengeance won't be lowered down. Should Trump be worried?
Look, Dan, this is frustrating for me because remember when we were in the Gulf, there was this exchange between General Freddie Franks, who was the 7th Corps commander, and he was speaking to, I think, 3 or 4 non-commissioned officers. One was a staff sergeant, and he was whining on, I just don't want to see anybody die. I don't want anything bad to happen. Finally, this sergeant, disgusted with what he was hearing, and rightly so, said, you know, General, we knew the job was dangerous when we took it. And I hate to be blunt about this, but if you are going to be Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces, yes, your life is at risk. It's always at risk. Get used to it. That's part of the deal, as he would say. So I don't know what the excitement is over his potential demise, but if he lives or dies, that is not supposed to decisively shape the future of the United States. He just happens to be president at the moment. We need to stop this discussion completely. And anybody who stands up and says, well, if we find any connection between the people that killed the president, if such a thing should happen, we'll go ahead and destroy wherever they're from. Well, that's absurd. That's complete nonsense. And it leads you into stupid acts. The dumbest one that springs immediately to mind was the assassination of the Archduke of Austria, the crown prince, frankly, who was going to replace the Austrian emperor. You didn't have to invade Serbia. Invading Serbia wasn't going to change anything. It certainly wasn't going to bring anybody back to life. And punishing an entire population wasn't going to endear you to them. It's just stupid. We need to get out of this. And Trump is out of touch with reality. I don't think that's news for anybody. I think it very much is. And quite frankly, his ego has reached new levels of irrationality. So I'm very uncomfortable talking about that. I think we ought to shut up about it. And we ought to understand that people right now are very emotional in Iran, and that's understanding. And we're going to hear these kinds of things. But we've got to get out of the business of figuring out how to sustain hatred, how to sustain violence, how to extend violence, and look at what we can do to bring an end to it. How do we stop it? Because if this continues on the current path, eventually others will be drawn in. And everybody says, well, Doug, explain how that happens. Well, I don't actually know. I can't say with absolute certainty what would bring in other great powers, but it would be a serious mistake to think that everyone will ultimately sit by and do nothing in perpetuity. Let's not tempt fate. So anyway, I'm sorry to get on my soapbox, but I find this really distasteful, this kind of nonsense.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the example you gave of what happened after the Archduke Ferdinand was killed turned into a world war that nobody thought was going to happen at the time. So your point is quite valid about what could happen here if we do that. Let's hope we don't have to find out. You mentioned a second ago one of the other issues that we'd like your view on, and that is with the Russia-Ukraine war. There have been some recent developments here. This just overnight, Ukraine hit 20 additional, and this has been going on. This is a new campaign. 20 additional Russian so-called shadow fleet vessels in the Black Sea overnight. Most of these were civilian vessels, according to the story here. The unmanned systems forces of Ukraine struck 20 vessels from Russia's so-called shadow fleet near the occupied Crimean Peninsula on the night of 14-15 July. Of the 20 vessels struck, 17 were oil tankers, 2 were gas tankers, and 1 was a tugboat. Russia yesterday had started belatedly getting back into this war here as well in the Black Sea and in the Sea of Azov, and they hit a civilian Ukrainian tanker. So now people are saying, is this the new theater of operations here, where now it's going to go back into more in the naval stuff? What impact is this going to have on the war?
Well, there's several points. The first is no one should delude themselves into believing that these kinds of strikes are going to rescue Ukraine from defeat, that this is going to turn around the war. That's all nonsense. Ukraine is doomed to destruction, sadly. And the second part of this is that the Ukrainians have taken advantage of relative indefensible targets at sea in the Russian Navy. You know, this goes back to some of the discussions we had recently when we were talking with Joe Kent. The Russians have learned a great deal. Their ground force has adapted brilliantly. If you look at what's happening along the front line of troops, where the edge of the battle is and where things are happening, the Russian troops have clearly learned how to cope with these unmanned systems. And instead of rushing in and executing these encirclements, what they call cauldron battles in the space of 2 or 3 days, it takes 10 days to 2 weeks because they want to avoid unnecessary casualties. And they know that the people that they're fighting have no chance. So it's very deliberate, it's very methodical, and it works. And they're ultimately destroying more and more and more ashore. What they haven't done is looked at the reality in the Black Sea. And when you go into these ports in Crimea or anywhere along the coast of the Black Sea that's Russian, it's very hard to protect these vessels that are sitting at anchor. And as they close with Ukraine, as they move in proximity to where these weapons are being launched from, it's harder and harder to protect them. They need to adjust things there. I think some heads are going to roll in the Russian naval forces. If I were going to predict anything, I think that's an absolute certainty, because this sort of business shouldn't happen. But finally, we need to understand that eventually this is going to end, and it's going to end with Russia in control of Odessa. It's going to end with Russia in control of Kharkov. It's going to end with Russian control of this thing they call Novorossiya. The Russians are not interested in owning Western Ukraine. They want it to be neutral. They don't want it to be another assembly point for future operations against them, which is exactly what we've done with it. And that's why they don't trust us anymore. That's why they're not going to really talk to us seriously. At least this administration has no chance of reaching them. And I think the Western globalists that are behind all this are being ignored. If they keep it up, then yes, they could be at risk of many things. But right now, Russians want to finish this business in eastern Ukraine once and for all. And that will involve taking Odessa. When they decide to do this is something I can't predict with certainty, but it will happen.
Well, somebody who wants to prevent it from happening is Ursula von der Leyen in the European Union, who herself flew into Kiev today, and she had a big press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky in light of his conversation with President Trump at the NATO summit a few days back. And Zelensky was feeling kind of froggy, and here's what he had to say.
Ukraine and Europe will create an anti-ballistic shield together for the first time, a historic project where Ukraine is not an observer, but one of the leaders, uniting countries and the strongest defense enterprises in Europe. The Freya project has been initiated. We will do everything to build a European anti-ballistic system by uniting all European anti-ballistic capabilities so that the skies of our nations are protected.
So, man, great news. Now there's going to be there used to be an iron curtain. Now there's going to be an air shield that's going to stop everything from Russia coming into Western Europe. And it's going to start right there in Ukraine. What do you say to that?
Well, I can see millions of Europeans lining up to deliver their first child to Zelensky so he can sell their organs and accumulate the cash that he needs to build this ridiculous notion. This is not going to happen. You and I know this. Bring back Ted Postel. There are many others besides Ted, and they're physicists, and they will tell you that until we can break the laws of physics and we figure out how to break the laws of fractal mathematics, develop the kind of energy that's required that'll make these particle beams work, and we create, Bill Shatner's beam me up capability or, shields that he calls for every time he's on the Starship Enterprise. We're a long way from that sort of thing. And if you don't have that, whatever you put up is not going to work. You can overwhelm it. And that's something the Russians have learned. They right now are protecting a front of at least 1,000 miles, if you look at it. They have been remarkably successful at stopping most of the unmanned systems, missiles, drones, and so forth hurled at them. But they never stop them all. Something always leaks through, because the technology we have is just not that good. Now, again, will that change at some point? I'm sure it will. But this is all literally nonsense. The Europeans are not going to chip in to the extent that they need to. This is another Star Wars defense bottomless pit for monies everywhere in Europe and the United States and anywhere else. And anybody who pushes for this is certifiable. Won't work.
And and even if they want to dream about this William Shatner stuff, the best case scenario is you're talking 3 to 5 years into the future before this could even produce these mythical, great interceptor missiles. Where is the mentality of these people think that they're going to? Do they really think? And maybe the answer is yes, that they can continue to fight for another 3 to 5 years, waiting for that new missile shield to come up.
Well, it's not a question what they think, it's what they believe. You and I know, we've talked about this before. It takes you roughly from start to finish 10 years to build a new army. That's what it took us to recover from the Vietnam War. The force that we took over in 1965 was utterly devastated. We had to start over. That meant everything had to change in some form. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but the outcome was what you saw in 1990 and 91. You've got a similar situation today. People do not understand what it takes to achieve the kind of military capability they're discussing. Everybody thinks, go down to the local supermarket, go to Aldi, go to Lidl, go to Giant, go down and you look on the shelves and you can buy missile defense. You can buy satellites. You can buy new stealth tanks that turn invisible. I mean, people don't know. They don't have any understanding. And that's the fault of our educational system. But politicians have nothing invested in the truth. They are permanently invested in fiction. You've seen this magnificent film called Waterworld. And, you have Dennis Hopper, who's now passed away, who holds up this little girl with a map on the back of her back and says, here's the map to dry land. And everybody, cheers. And he said, so dry land is within reach. Now row. And everybody runs off to row and row and row. And then one of the people says, well, are you sure about this? He says, who cares? They'll row for 2 weeks because they figure out that I'm full of crap. Unfortunately, I think that's the mentality that works so terribly well in politics in the West. Just tell them whatever you need to, and it'll be weeks before they figure out it's a lot of nonsense.
And by then you'll have some new nonsense. One of the other things that is also happening, and not just in the Sea of Azov with the advancement of this striking these ships, but there's also movements in the Baltics to where there's a growing chorus that's pointing to fingers to Russia and saying they're going to invade us and they're going to invade Western Europe. That question was put to Dmitry Peskov this morning, and he had this to say.
Литовская разведка сообщила о том, что Россия якобы планирует атаки на инфраструктуру Прибалтики и Европы. И в связи с этим литовский президент Гитанас Науседа призвал усилить охрану важных инфраструктурных объектов. Как бы вы могли прокомментировать свежую порцию обвинений и подозрений со стороны прибалтийского государства?
Вы знаете, это именно свежая порция таких страшилок для того, чтобы продолжить промывание мозгов и для того, чтобы готовить население к дальнейшей милитаризации. Для этого нужно создать образ врага на какой-то другой стороне, в данном случае на нашей, и под эту лавочку, как у нас говорят, продолжить подтягивать в страны Прибалтики военную инфраструктуру.
I'm not sure if you could read all that on the bottom, but the bottom line is he was asked about the claim that Russia is going to attack into Western Europe and possibly even into the Baltics. And he almost says, ironically, a version of what you just said there, there's no truth. They're just saying this to try to build up they have to have an enemy and they're making us an enemy here. But that's not in our interest here. But, I actually have the question, though, Doug, if they say this enough, meaning on the West, and they start moving like more German troops into the Baltics, they start doing more missile defense, and they bring in more potential NATO capability. Could this be a self-fulfilling prophecy where Russia will eventually feel compelled to do something in the Baltics?
Well, I think to a large extent, the NATO leadership has been trying, certainly for the last 2 or 3 years, to bait President Putin. And by that, I mean bait him into acting recklessly in response to this kind of nonsense. Why would they do that? Why would they say these things? And I think one of the big reasons is that they are trying desperately to drag us in. Okay? This is the Israeli strategic program. How do we drag in the United States? What has Netanyahu said repeatedly? We share the same enemies. Our interests are the same. We are the same people. No, we are not Israelis. We don't share their values. We don't share their culture. They're very different from us. There's nothing wrong with that, but they're not the same. We do not share the same enemies. In fact, we don't have to have very many enemies at all. That's the great genius of the American Republic and the people that founded it who understood it 250 years ago. There's no reason for us to have these enemies. So the biggest mistake that I think Putin could make is to be baited into something. And right now, that's the danger. Not so much that anybody in the Baltic states is dumb enough to fire any missiles into Russia. Now, they've been foolish insofar as they have allowed the Ukrainians to use their territory and airspace from time to time to attack targets in Russia. Big mistake. That should stop as soon as possible. And I pay tribute to the Russians for exercising restraint and not overreacting to that kind of stupidity. I think the Poles are waking up. The Poles have finally figured out that this Ukrainian state is a criminal organization. It's not just a money pit that will never be filled. It's much worse than that. So I don't see any evidence that the Poles are going to sign up for any of this stupidity anymore. It'll take time to climb down from it because being anti-Russian is almost inseparable from being a Polish nationalist. It's sort of like the Irish nationalists had to be anti-English in order to be Irish nationalists. Well, the Poles have a similar problem. But I think they can overcome that. The problem is with these globalists further west, and their agenda is the destruction of us. They're much more concerned about ensuring that Europe is overrun by millions of non-Europeans and ultimately destroys Europe from within than they are about anything that happens in Russia. But that means that you also want to point to an external enemy. The problem is the external enemy is not the enemy. The enemy is their own government. And I think more and more Europeans are figuring that out. Eventually, it will result in a dramatic upheaval on the scale of the revolutions of 1848. I think they're coming.
Well, that's certainly not going to be good for anybody. Interestingly, President Putin, you talk about is he going to be invaded or not? He made a speech before at a public auditorium, I think it was yesterday, to where he may actually be supporting what you said there, that he's going to be a little bit more patient. But he also talk about looking at scoreboards, kind of laid out, here's what the West has been trying to do to us up to this point. And here in his interpretation is the score.
We ask ourselves why this Russophobic part of the collective West fights us, and we, in response, develop our economy, strengthen our financial system, improve our military, achieve new results in our industrial complex, and we're moving forward, we're advancing, our boys, our troops are advancing. How does that happen? Well, that is thanks to you, thanks to your efforts.
So he said, we tried to destroy them with sanctions. We tried to destroy their economy. We tried to destroy them militarily by helping Ukraine, et cetera. And he said, instead, we're stronger. We outlasted them financially and economically. And he seems to say they're on the right path. So does that tell you that Russia may not strike at any of those things, even if the long-range missiles keep coming in and they'll just do the slow, methodical path?
I think he's going to stick with the slow, methodical path because that's his preferred method. On the other hand, I think he understands the anger and frustration inside the Russian population. I mean, how could you not be angry when Russian citizens in St. Petersburg or Moscow or Rostov are killed mindlessly on the street as a result of some rogue drone attack that has no real military utility at all? So I think that's quite clear. But there's something more important here that we should bear in mind. Russia, if you talk to Russians and if you take the trouble to read what they publish, the Russians are very open about saying, look, our society is not perfect, but we're working on it. Our economy is not as strong as it should be, but we're working on it. And our military was too weak. We've changed that, and we're working on it. In other words, there's an awareness of imperfection. There's an awareness that things have to improve, and there's a readiness to do it, to support it, to make it happen. That's why Russia is not going to be defeated. That's why we're in trouble. Because if you turn to the Americans say, well, this government. And I agree with them. I think the government has failed us. I think the social contract is defunct. But that doesn't mean we don't need a government. We very much need a government. We just don't need what we've got. And that's not a function of just Donald Trump. That's the whole shebang that we've had for the last 30 plus years. We can deal with that. And Americans have to come around to understanding that has to change, and they have to understand we can do that. We can actually make a difference. We haven't gotten there yet because we don't have adequate organization and leadership. I hope that comes. I'm working on it, as you are, and I think a lot of other people are. But I think it's very important to understand the Russian mentality. And I think Putin enjoys the support he does to the tune of, 82%, 83% approval, because he speaks in those terms, and that resonates very strongly with the Russian people.
It's just, wow, you couldn't have set this up any better. In a bad way, sort of. You talk about the Russians are aware of their imperfections and they're working on it in all these different categories. And then you contrast that with the United States. Well, it turns out I got a couple of examples of that in the last few minutes that we got here. Let's take a look at just within our own borders here. right now we are trying to get, number one, we're trying to get for the NDAA a $1.5 trillion defense budget, a massive growth in just a single year from $1 trillion, which is already way more than anybody else. But apparently even that's not enough. Now we're trying to slide in a $350 billion supplemental on top of that. And listen to the explanation given by Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
The question was, can you list the specifics of what the request is for the Pentagon? We've seen it's over $350 billion as a request, and some of this is transformational kind of funding that will help us change the dynamic of the Department of War and make it more efficient and effective. It's already the greatest fighting force on the planet, not even close. But there are some ideas, a real vision on how to improve that even further, to bolster that. You've heard the president talk about how he wants to effectively double the funding for national defense. Look, we live in dangerous times. We're fighting communism on our own shores, and we're fighting evil terrorists and tyrants around the world. And we have to be able to protect our national security. So this is not the place to get into the details of that.
So we're the greatest fighting force in history of all time. No one else is even close. He repeats President Trump. Well, if it was, then why am I going to spend another $500 billion and $350 more billion on top of that? And, you know, it sounds to me like, Doug, and this is what I'd like your view on, it sounds to me like we're looking for monsters to slay so that we can justify the money.
Well, that goes without saying, but there's also just a lot of corruption involved in this. Let's look at the first comment that he made. He starts talking about all these alleged enemies. But you and I know that those are lies. He did mention one enemy. Now, he called it communism. I presume he's talking about the new mayor of New York City, who obviously identifies strongly with the tenets of Karl Marx in many respects. And he's characterizing that as an enemy. Okay. I'll sign up at least insofar as he's identified a serious problem here inside the United States. I can come up with lots of problems inside the U.S. I can come up with lots of threats. I can say, look, what do you do about the majority of young men and women between the ages of 20 and 40 inside the United States who can't find employment? And those that do, that make any money, aren't making more than 60, 70, 80,000 a year. And after you pay rent and you pay for your groceries and you're dealing with inflation as well as your gasoline and so forth, you've got nothing left, which means you effectively have no savings. I think that's an existential threat to the republic. I think we have more than 50 million people living inside the United States who were not born in this country. That's a serious problem. That's a larger percentage of our population than ever in our history. And it's not benign. Lots of these people have come here and they're determined to make us over into what they think we ought to be. The last time I looked, everybody wanted to come here because they liked it the way it is. All of a sudden now, everybody that built the society, the country, the industries, the science, the technology is no longer liked because they happen to be white. This kind of nonsense needs to stop, but nobody's addressing it. And Mike Johnson isn't going to touch it with a 10-foot pole. He and his opponents on the left are all in the same boat on these things. They don't want to take on these difficult issues. But the overseas picture, that's crap. There are no Russian armies or Chinese armies or navies or anything else gathering forces to invade us. Nobody's interested in wasting money on it. That's why all of these claims in Europe are ludicrous nonsense. The Europeans don't want to waste money trying to build some giant force with which to invade Russia. There's no reason to invade Russia. Russia doesn't want to invade them. This is crap. And somebody needs to stand up and say it's crap, but you're feeding at the trough. That trough in Washington is huge. It's a mountain of slop. And all the pigs have rushed in. And they want to keep feeding. And they're dependent upon a government that feeds them. By the way, they're not feeding us. Our population, 90% of it, is not benefiting in any way, shape, or form. 10% of the population owns everything and spends all the money.
Well, and just to put a sharp point on that, later today, President Trump is going to be at a meeting. He's actually going to make some public statements, and this here, he's going to address the defense technology gathering, even as the Iran war has reduced our weapons stockpiles. Key things in here. The White House said the summit is bringing together key leaders in defense and some of the largest global investors to spotlight the importance of national security. There we go again. We're looking at those dragons overseas to go slay. But then you look at that long list of folks who are right there at that trough you just described, trying to get some of that $350 billion and then the $1.5 trillion next year. Where does this end, Doug?
Well, looking at the list, we all know who Jamie Dimon is. And to his credit, recently, he's been pointing to the danger that lurks of a complete financial collapse. He's talked about the bond market. He understands the debasement of currency. I don't know what he would say in private, but one would hope that Dimon would carry that message to the president. This is not the time to spend more on much of anything. I don't know Blackstone, can't comment, or the others. I know that this Phoebe Novakovic is a former CIA employee. She may still be a CIA officer who is currently heading General Dynamics. I don't know. These people are the enemies of anyone who wants to reduce spending. They're the enemies of anyone who doesn't want to double down on spending on their pet projects, their pet rocks. And they feel justified. And they are part of this multi-million-dollar / billion-dollar elite, the Epstein class, as we call them. They're in charge. And that's what they want. And we are not in charge. We have no influence. You know, this is where you find that even though I would not have voted for Mamdani in New York City, and I dislike many of the things he says, he's ultimately telling the truth about the Epstein class. And he's not the only one. There has to be some common ground between the two sides of these arguments, because we got to put a stop to this stuff. We're not going to survive this if we keep it up. And you and I and a lot of others have talked about these problems for years. We're approaching the point of no return.